Hello and welcome everyone. Hope you're having a good time at Kanji this year. My name's Dan the Video Ninja, and I am here to talk to you about video games. This is my third year in a row bringing you all some stories and info about games for Kanji. In the past years, I've used this opportunity to speak mostly about smaller, more indie type games that might remind you of some of the other games out there that we all remember from years and maybe even decades past. Well, this year is no different because I've got a new list of games to dive into. They are all newer, possibly more obscure games, but they all have a few things in common with classic games from back in the day that I'm sure most of you will recognize. Some of these indie titles you may have heard of, but I'm hoping there's at least one fresh entry on this list for everyone here. Should be a lot of fun. Feel free to pop off in the Twitch chat. I've got it pulled up here and everything so I can see you at all. And, us streamers, we love it when people go crazy with emotes and punctuation and exclamation marks and capitalization. I'll try to keep things brisk here too. I did kind of pack this in 1 hour of content in kind of full and whatever, so I might get a chance in between games, whatever, to have a look at the chat and maybe answer a quick question here or there, but I want to keep things kind of going at a really brisk pace here. If there's time near the end of the panel or whatever, and we've got time to maybe dive a little bit into something that I might mention during the panel and you want to talk about it a little bit more, we might do it there, or there's the Kanji Discord, of course. I think there's a video game channel on there that you can also dive into if you want to hit that up for information as well. If you remember, this is also the third year that I've done this. This is called The Revenge, because I'm just so clever with titles. If you remember how I did this panel last year, I kind of introduced every single indie title that I'm going to be going through with a talk about an older game or an older gaming franchise, and that's the first half of each of these sections. I call that the Do You Remember part, where I'm going to be looking for those sweet member berries, and then we're going to be going into the titular part of each section, which is called the There's an Indie Gaming for that section. So that should be what we're going to do here, and that should be a lot of fun. So let's get to the good stuff. With the first entry here, who here remembers Ninja Gaiden? Here's a classic title that really needs no introduction. What could have made for a more perfect coupling in the 80s than video games and ninjas? This was a time in the long, long ago when ninja games were really stripped down to the core elements of perfect movement, reflexive attacks, and stubborn determination. Because nobody said being a ninja was easy, and that was the point. The Ninja Gaiden trilogy was a hugely successful trilogy on the NES, and it remains a foundational pioneer of tough-as-nails gaming for many fans to this very day. Plus, it also had terrific production value and graphics and sound, as well as a story that featured actual cutscenes and plot developments. That wasn't something we usually saw in 8-bit games way back in the day. But it all really came down to the challenge that these games put forward to its players. Those of us who were able to push past some of the insane difficulty curves and punishing game over screens again and again and again, and actually finish any of these games, were among the first generation to know what it felt like to get good and earn those sweet playground bragging rights. Plus, we also got to see everything the game had to offer while feeling like badass ninjas in the process. Well, there's an indie for that. Cyber Shadow keeps true to the core design choices of old-school Ninja Gaiden games by being a level-by-level gauntlet of skilled platforming and tough-as-nails action. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was just a long-lost fourth entry in the original Ninja Gaiden series, given how precisely the developers nailed the exact sweet spot for challenging, maybe even a little bit punishing difficulty in the jump-and-slash actioner that you see there. Tasked with slicing your way through a robot army in a quest for vengeance or salvation or something, you'll be assaulted in a game like this from all angles by soldiers, robots, monsters of all shapes and sizes, spike traps, pits, fire traps, you name it. You'll have to slash, wall jump, and employ every tool and power-up you can find just to make your way to the next valuable checkpoint. And make no mistake, you will struggle and die again and again trying to make those checkpoints. But each one claimed will be a hard victory won as you march forward level after level to even tougher challenges. Luckily, you do have a lot of skills and powers that build up over time as you play and to combat these ever-increasing challenges. By the middle of this game, you'll have additional methods of attack beyond just, your horizontal slash attack, as well as a plethora of traversal skills that will truly have you feeling like a lightning-fast master of ninjutsu. When you gain the power midway through the game to quickly dash through areas and cleave enemies in half over and over, you'll find entire sections of the levels just disappear behind you as you zip from screen to screen without even touching the ground. The spirit of classic ninja action games has been wonderfully recreated in Cyber Shadow without sacrificing the challenging aspect of what made games like this and its ancestors so memorable. If there was ever a time when you were younger and you spent a weekend slashing away and nearly snapping your controller to the point where you almost felt like a ninja yourself, Cyber Shadow here offers you a brand new experience that's just for you. Kind of looks like the Batman NES game, also a tough-as-nails game. Yeah, does anybody remember finishing that one? Does anybody here remember Quake? If you had a PC in the early 90s, there's a good chance that you had a copy of Doom installed on it. In fact, didn't most PCs in the 90s, weren't there more PCs in the 90s that had Quake or Doom rather than Windows installed on it? Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent there. But if you had a PC in the late 90s, there's also a good chance that you at least had the shareware version of this masterpiece, Quake, on it. God, remember shareware? This was the age, after all, of the first major wave of mindless first-person shooters, and although Wolfenstein 3D and Doom may have gotten there first with their sprites and Sound Blaster magic, yes, I'm old, Quake arrived at the dawn of the 3D graphics era to blow open the floodgates for a tsunami of run-and-gun shooter titles to follow. It wasn't hard at all to see why so many fans fell in love with Quake's brown corridors and hyper-violent monster-blasting gameplay. For the first time ever, we could zip around a 3D space with keyboard and mouse precision, like we never could in earlier 3D first-person shooter games, like GoldenEye, for example, on the N64. This new freedom of movement made the game feel faster and more intense, with enemies able to ambush us from any direction, but also fall prey to our Lone Ranger's character's heightened sense of tactical awareness. You could see a lot more around you and hear a lot more around you, and you could do a lot more in a game like this. I mean, Quake is often cited the game where rocket jumping was invented. And the setting and flavor of a game like Quake was also something new and more suited to that late 90s grungy sensibility. Doom rocked more like a heavy metal album cover look and sound with devils and hellscapes, but Quake had Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails backing it up with droning, eerie atmosphere and Lovecraftian cosmic horrors skulking around waiting to terrorize the player. It gave the first-person shooter a personality all of its own and locked it in as one of the most atmospheric and iconic FPS games of the early 3D gaming generation. And believe it or not, there's an indie for that. Recently, the so-called boomer shooter trend has exploded all over the indie gaming scene, with dozens of titles that harken back to the days before military hardware and grizzled space marines took over the landscape. In this new wave of retro throwbacks, odes to the classic works by id Software, 3D Realms, and game engines like the Doom engine, the Quake engine, the Build engine, they're popping up almost every single month. One of them is Dusk here, which is a passion project made by game developer David Zemensky that stands as a full-length answer to the question, could a 90s first-person shooter game made in the late 2010s work? The answer is yes, by the way. Dusk drops the player into the setting of a cursed Midwestern countryside, dilapidated industrial complexes, and even cosmic horrorscapes in some cases, with a heavy arsenal and an army of enemies just between the player and the level's exit. Everything from the low-fidelity textures to the simplistic yet well-designed polygons used for the enemies, objects, buildings looks like it was ripped wholesale from a forgotten 90s first-person shooter lost long ago in some bargain bin. But what wasn't lost was the familiar sense of speed and fluidity and the movement and gunplay that the memorable games made on simpler technology were famous for. In fact, Dusk takes the nostalgic sense of strafing, ducking, and rocket jumping from the old days and builds on those conventions in exciting and innovative new ways, to the point where your character can literally be somersaulting through the air while unleashing double-handed shotgun blasts on everything underneath you. That is something you can pull off in this game. It's all killer, no filler when it comes to a game like Dusk. It makes makes smart design decisions that might raise a few confused eyebrows for those of us more used to conventional gaming mechanics, such as removing any fall damage. There's no fall damage in this game. There's no underwater breathing mechanic in this game. You can breathe underwater as long as you want in this game. But it does things like that in the pursuit of making like the moment-to-moment gameplay run and gun action much more tight and focused and fun. Likewise, the primitive-looking graphics might not be what draws in anyone who'd rather see their high-end graphics card put to better use, but the rich and varied atmosphere even those simple flat textures and polygons are used to convey are ingeniously employed to give the whole game a wonderful atmosphere. If you've had enough with hordes of zombies or masked soldiers and want to take on a first-person adventure more akin to the monster-slaying, horror movie-inspired shooters of the old DOS days, Dusk is a hidden gem of an action game that celebrates and elevates everything that we remember loving about point-and-shoot and mayhem games of yesteryear. Fun! Lots of fun. Speaking of fun, who remembers The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening? It was the first Zelda game on a handheld console. It was the first Zelda game that wasn't about saving a princess. It was the first Zelda game not set in Hyrule. No Ganon, no Triforce. Just our plucky little elf boy stuck on a brand new island with a brand new adventure. That still admittedly involved going into a half-dozen dungeons looking for keys, bosses, and magical problem-solving MacGuffins, granted. But still, Link's Awakening came hot on the heels of what was at the time not only the most widely loved and highly rated Zelda game, this being Link to the Past, but which was also a flagship Super Nintendo title, still regarded as one of the system's bests to this day. That game introduced conventions into the Zelda franchise that would become staples throughout years and decades, like Link to the Past was the introduction of the Master Sword, for example. But after all that praise and success, here comes the very next game in the franchise, and it's an unassuming little left turn in the franchise that was at once similar but also very different. The rock-solid foundation of exploration and dungeon crawling had subtle tweaks to it that shook up the Legend of Zelda formula. Link could finally unglue his trusty sword from his hand, for example, and instead rely on his arsenal of bombs, bows, magic rods, and other tools in new ways that we'd never seen before. So this method of experimenting with the established gameplay mechanics, just one sequel after setting them in stone, would become a recurring design choice for the franchise as time went on. Majora's Mask, anybody. But Link's Awakening was the tiny little game that proved that Nintendo's #2 franchise could make something fresh and unique out of already tried and tested ventures in old-school adventure gaming. And guess what? There's an indie for that. Developer Yacht Club Games struck the earth in 2015 with their runaway breakout title, Shovel Knight, and since then they've expanded that franchise into multiple sequels, spin-offs, cameos, and other indie games. But now it's their turn to take a stab at a brand new franchise of their own with Mina the Hollower. And just like before, they too are looking to divert from what made them a household name in the gaming circuit, while still staying true to what fans have come to know them for. Gameplay in Mina the Hollower, as you can see here, is very old school, mostly consisting of dungeon crawling, where each section of the dungeon takes up, one whole screen or whatever. And it's kind of just like those old handheld games, those old handheld Zelda games. Besides treasure hunting and trap dodging, the adventurous little Mina here also has to face down hordes of baddies as well. And in this respect, she's not only following in the footsteps of Link, but another similar Golden Age gaming protagonist, because her weapon is a whip. So we've got a little bit of Simon Belmont mixed in there too, because her attack methods are very much like the famous vampire hunter's standard weapon. This means that offense, paired with an adorably on-brand method of traversal via burrowing underneath things, underneath the ground or whatever, allows Mina to weave her way around the levels and dangers, not unlike Link was doing with his newly acquired jumping abilities in Link's Awakening when you got the Rock Feather, I think it's called. It was clear upon their arrival that Yacht Club Games was looking to adopt and improve the conventions of classic games in the 8-bit era with their cerulean treasure hunter, and now they look to also win over those of us who remember adventuring with Link on long road trips and bus rides as well. Mina the Hollower looks to make what's old new again, and probably better. Always looking for games on a plane, for sure. Moving on, how many of you guys remember WarioWare? It wasn't until Wario washed out as both a Bowser and a Mario stand-in during the few games that he showed up in originally that Nintendo's most famous doppelganger finally found his footing in the now famous micro-game compilation series WarioWare. Instead of trying to fit somewhere in the more traditional platformers, he became the frontman for this bizarre new experiment in gaming on Nintendo's then new console, the Wii. And with him came this bizarre new aesthetic that gave the character and the franchise a unique energy to match its unique gameplay. The frantic, fast-paced, rapid-fire game-swapping setup of WarioWare was conceived at first as a shortcut method to demonstrate how the Wii's motion controller interface could be used for more than just, virtual bowling or tennis. But infused with the chaotic antics of Wario and his colorful entourage, it became an entire genre of gaming all on its own. It was a hyperactive, turn-based party activity that gave players a small, novel experience every few seconds, and it gave developers a near endless string of blank canvases to design tiny little gaming experiences on. Nothing was off the table when it came to designing all the fun little activities that would show up in games like this. Sometimes the characters were doing menial tasks, but maybe in an inventive or funny way. Sometimes they were participating in samplings of traditional video gameplay like platforming. Sometimes they were just literally asked to just straight up play an old NES game for 10 seconds. It was a brilliant fusion of non-stop novelty mixed in with the sights and sounds that were unmistakably drenched in a beloved realm of ephemera. Well, there's an indie for that. This is Spookware, and this is probably the easiest pitch of all the games that I have for you guys. It's Halloween WarioWare. So, this all began as a little game jam experiment, and it's not at all hard to understand why. Game jams are often, a bunch of developers getting together over a weekend and hashing out bite-sized little game concepts over a small period of time. And what would be better fit for those kind of conditions than a micro-game compilation? The developers took their original prototype of this, which was very rough and a little gritty and whatnot, but still had a very grungy feel because it was soaked in like horror and B-movie schlock or whatever. And they doubled down on it with a follow-up game, which is what you're seeing footage of now here, that expanded on the minigames and also gave the game a face. Well, not like a Wario face. It was more like a skull. Well, more like three skulls, as you can see there. The three mascots of this series are the Skelly brothers, adorably named Righty, Meaty, and Lefty. And they get it in their skulls one boring weekend to binge a horror movie marathon that acts as the framing device for all the mini-games. See, they're just sitting in their basement, flicking their way through all the horror movies, and that's where all the mini-games come from. So from there, the players get to tackle all those mini-games in quick succession as more schlocky-looking games pop up here and there. And every time, you get 3 strikes, which represents each of the 3 skeleton brothers before you're out and you have to start over. It's a simple premise, simple execution, but it's lots of fun, especially for those of you who are out there who are looking to share something quick and gamey and some antic-y fun stuff with your horror-loving friends around Halloween season. Speaking of horror, though, how many of you guys remember Resident Evil? What more needs to be said about what most would consider patient zero for the modern survival horror game? This franchise has come a long way and had a few different facelifts here and there, but when it first burst onto the scene in the late 90s as a cheesy homage to Romero-style zombie flicks, Resident Evil caught a lot of people off guard, not only with its striking, R-rated visuals, but with its fresh new survival horror mechanics. All the juicy blood splatter and chilling zombie moans certainly set the stage, but I think what most people remember latching onto about early Resident Evil games was how keenly the gameplay was also centered around tension. Your movement and vision was, hard to control, almost on purpose. The inventory system was designed specifically to make item and weapon management a hassle. And the bizarre layout of the mansions and police stations and underground laboratories you were exploring meant that no room was easy to get into, and every key that you needed was always a journey and usually a danger to try and retrieve. So, challenges in those games forced gamers to think on their toes and weigh every decision they made as every time they stepped into a hallway they haven't been in before, or just stepped out of a safe room, for example. And the voice acting was bad too. Yeah, that was another thing that we had to struggle through. It made direct combat also a consideration in a game like this, rather than the default option that combat had always been in most zombie blasting games up until this point. Later on, we would see the franchise, we would see Capcom pivot backward towards a more action-heavy sensibility, admittedly. But the early games in Resident Evil were just as much about scavenging for survival as they were about combat and gunplay. And there's an indie for that. This is called Signalis. Right down to its early PlayStation 1 era graphics, Signalis is borrowing more than a few notes from Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill, all the early 3D survival horror games. You've got hordes of nasty enemies looking to rip you apart between yourself and the other side of every room you go into in this game, and there is not a lot of ammunition for those 2 or 3 weapons that you do manage to discover along the way. The setting of this game, though, trades up the spooky mansions and Halloween horrors for something that looks a little bit more out of something like Neo Genesis Evangelion, but you're still moving from room to room, keeping an eye out for anything that might keep you alive as deranged and deformed monstrosities stalk the hallways. You will never find enough bullets or equipment in this game, by the way, to take on all the baddies. So often in this game, stealth and knowing when it's best to cheese it are paramount in keeping yourself alive, rather than just standing your ground and unloading every piece of ammo you have. Even when you do manage to drop an enemy, much like their undead predecessors, the baddies in this game rarely stay on the ground for very long, unless you dump additional resources on them to keep them there. And since you're stuck with a permanently tiny inventory throughout this entire game, you're going to have to quickly weigh your options every single time you come across any supplies or key progress items, because you won't always have room for them, and you're going to have to deal with that. If you're looking for that old feeling of excitement from just barely escaping and surviving monstrous odds and a bit more of a late 90s anime flavor, Signalis has exactly the challenge that you are looking for. I remember the zombie dogs that busted through the window early in the game. Wow, back then. Yeah, everybody got a jump out of that one. A little bit of water here. All right. How many of you guys remember, what is the next one? Oh, yeah, this one. I think I put this one on my list as a joke, but we'll see. How many of you guys remember Pong? I try to wax nostalgic about as much as possible here about all of these games and these Do You Remember sections, but this one, I'm not sure what I could say that just looking at the gameplay footage can't tell you already inside of a few seconds. It's Pong. Even the majority of us older nerds will attest that this was before even our time as tiny gamers. Being nostalgic for Pong is like being nostalgic for something like ice cream or nursery rhymes or just what it felt like to stand in sunlight, But what I can speculate on was how it must have felt to our gaming ancestors, our older gaming relatives and whatnot, that were fond of playing games that amounted to little more than just, playing with toys, whether it was like bicycles, jump ropes, balls, ping pong paddles, for example. And then suddenly, 50 years ago, here comes some computer whizzes, and they take something familiar like the activity of batting a ball back and forth across a table and translate it into little lines and dots and lights flickering on what I imagine was a gigantic, very heavy television screen. I like to think that after the immediate spectacle of seeing what was at the time probably the first video game ever created, once that wore off, what was left in the imagination of those who saw it were all the possibilities and potential that even something as simple as a couple of lines traveling up and down the screen attempting to block a dot could possibly have. And guess what? There's an indie for that, if you can believe it. Hyper Galactic Psychic Table Tennis 3000. Wow, that's a long title. Here it is. It's Pong again, but with all of that imagination I just mentioned fully realized. And then reapplied back around to Pong itself with a self-aware sense of humor. This is what's all been leading up to, folks. 50 years of gaming development and innovation just to bring us all back to where it all started with everything we've learned along the way. This game here, what it does is it takes the back and forth of Pong and tries to apply by force as many conventional gaming mechanics to it as it possibly can. So yeah, it's Pong, but you've also got RPG style stat boosting, because your paddle has a health bar now and can be defeated. You can learn spells and abilities like fireballs or slowing time or healing your paddle. There's even dialogue that you can share with the opponent paddles between matches. Dialogue that can lead to charming and even romancing the paddles you're up against instead of battling, because not even dialogue-based dating simulators are off the table when it comes to the kind of gaming experiences that this game has decided needs to be applied to Pong. Besides mechanics, the presentation also has a little bit of a modern facelift applied to it with all the subtlety of a jackhammer. Pong never really needed a story or a plot, but this game has one, be as silly as it is. Pong never had any use for voice acting, but there's a lot of that in here too. The paddles were sufficient as two white vertical lines, but here they can take the rectangular shape and size and color of just about anything you can imagine. There's music in the game, there's art design applied to the background of the matches, sort of. Even the concept of your player character, that is, your little paddle, being a character is on full display in this game, because the game treats your character with the same reverence as Link or maybe Frisk or other similar silent protagonists. So, half a century can take us from two little lines and a dot to all corners of the imagination when it comes to game design. But sometimes imagination like that gets a little homesick, I think, for where it all began, which can lead to fun little updates to an established formula that can prove to be fun and fresh in their own weird little way. Is there a dog? Can you pet it? Yes. Yes, there is. Anyway, how many of you guys out there remember Thief? By the late 90s, the first-person shooter genre, as we've talked about at length already, had a very strong foothold in the PC gaming landscape. So much so, I think, that a sort of super saturation point for mindless run-and-gun action fare was pretty much inevitable, and from that we would see derivatives emerge that would attempt to take the first-person mechanics in new directions. In the same year that we saw a more narrative focus emerge in games like Half-Life, we also saw an inversion of the high-octane blasting fests like Doom and Quake, with a game that was more focused on stealth and tactics. We got Thief. In Thief, you didn't play as a raging anger golem or explosive lunatic capable of blazing through a whole mob of bad guys on adrenaline alone. Instead, players had to rely on cunning and craftiness, ducking in and out of shadows and avoiding drawing the attention to themselves in order to move silently through all the manors and castles and alleyways that they weren't supposed to be in. And combat was never a primary focus, as most of the enemies that you encountered in a game like Thief were far better equipped than you were for a straight fight. And the game actually even rewarded players who could maneuver their way through levels without engaging the enemy NPCs in any way. In addition, this game was sort of also an inversion on the moral themes of most video games of the time, In a game like this, you weren't a righteous hero slaying evil beasts or rescuing those in need. No, it was right there in the title. You were a thief. Your goal was always self-serving, and at the end of every level, your score was based on not how many foes you could dispatch, but rather how much loot you could scoop up and before you made your escape. Thief turned darkness and situational awareness into the player's friend and made way for other games set not in burning hellscapes or scorched battlefields, but rather in dark, corrupted cities and castles that only the clever would survive long enough to profit from diving into. And there's an indie for that. Sometimes it feels like the developer New Blood is trying to follow the same course as the whole first-person shooter genre from about 1995 onward. After the success with traditional run-and-gun throwbacks like Dusk, which we were just talking about, and games like Ultra Kill, they set out to make their own answer to the Thief series with a game called Gloomwood, which looks almost deliberately exactly like the early Thief games, and it plays a lot like them too. This game drops you into a similar maze of twisting urban sprawl and fills it to the brim with dangerous characters who all wander around patrol routes looking that you'll have to dodge your way around lest they spot you and they very violently deal with you. Once again, combat is by no means the most efficient means of dealing with all the hostiles in your way in this game. Sure, there are guns, and on occasion you might be forced to use them, but ammo is scarce, and always be aware that you are very much outnumbered in a game like this, no matter where you are. And a loud bang is going to draw everyone and everything nearby towards you. So you got to think about that. The atmosphere here in this game has kind of an early industrial feel with tunnels and dark cobblestone streets all littered with steaming pipes, strange electric mechanisms, and opulent furniture decorations. And there's a lot of secrets in this game to find, too. You know, just like Thief, you were always hunting for something. Now in this, you're always hunting for something, too. Although this is less to do with filling your pockets full of gold and gems and more to do with scavenging for an extra bullet or two for your revolver that might just save your life. Similar to how games I was just talking about, like Dusk and Medieval and whatnot, were polished up love letters to 25-year-old first-person PC games, Gloomwood here affects an old-school look and feel while sanding off the edges with decades of game design innovation and quality of life improvements. It's a spooky, gothic stealth game that would have been right at home alongside all of the other breakout first-person games in the early 90s and early 2000s at the turn of the century. Oh, I'm very interested here. That's what I like to see. I like to see that. Yep. Full game of that actually just got released very recently. How am I doing for time here? All right, I'm blazing through this stuff. All right. Oh, I got a good one. Since we're still on the spooky stuff here, let's jump into this next one. Who remembers Silent Hill? Of course you remember Silent Hill. Barely a conversation about horror games around the turn of the century, or even just best game ever lists goes by without at least one entry from this iconic franchise turning up. Showing up right around when Resident Evil was blowing everybody's brains out over how exciting the, at the time, realistic monstrous horrors could be, here comes Silent Hill, this surreal little slice of Japanese horror to plant its flag as one of the most endearing, spooky franchises in all of gaming. Silent Hill's developers made smart decisions back in the day in order to use the technology that they had at the time to their advantage. It would have been a very taxing drain on the resources they had available to them to try and nudge their way onto the gaming scene by just doing what Capcom and its zombies were doing, but, bigger. So instead, they set their game in a little abandoned town and soaked it in a layer of very processor-friendly fog, which saved them a lot of programming headaches. But it also gave the entire game this very iconic identity, And then they saved themselves even more headaches by aiming for a type of horror that wasn't always, screaming in the player's face all the time, but instead trying to psych the player out with symbolism and atmosphere. And again, this was something that the early console limitations actually helped them out with. The dreamlike look of and feel of all these nightmarescapes that the player had to explore in Silent Hill, and the otherworldly design of the characters and creatures that they found tapped into the player's imaginations better than any low-poly zombie ever could. And, what could be scarier or more convenient to a small dev team than the players scaring themselves? Years later, there are countless gamers out there looking for that same Silent Hill magic that managed to spook them, not with blood and guts and sudden startles, but with eerie senses of dread and atmosphere. Most of us have made peace with the fact that nothing will likely ever come close to the lightning in a bottle experience that classic Silent Hill games managed to capture, but we're always going to be on the lookout for the next attempt. And there are so many indies for that. I'll be honest with you, it was hard for me to narrow down which indie horror game that's come out in the last decade at least I wanted to feature as my analog to classic Silent Hill games. I wasn't kidding when I said the search has never ended for that Silent Hill magic, and with more and more developers who remember playing the classics during their formative years now reaching developer age in the 2020s, there's no end of the number of small, spooky games being released online every month. Hit me up on Kanji's Discord in the gaming channel there, and I can give you a whole further reading list. For now, though, Lost in Vivo. From the screenshots and the gameplay footage that you're seeing here, you might be thinking that this is just another Lost in the Dark first-person spookfest, like Slender or Amnesia. But this indie from a few years ago really did a good job, I think, of nailing the atmosphere that I think so many of us Silent Hill junkies are looking for. The game starts off with a simple enough premise. You're exploring an underground sewer tunnel looking for your beloved missing pet dog. Aww. And then things just get weird. Like, the tunnels seem to go on forever in impossible directions. The amount of off-putting stuff you find all over keeps ratcheting up. And soon you're clinging to whatever hammers, guns, maps, and other tools you can find to defend yourself and escape from whatever the hell's down there with you. So very little about what this game throws at you is explained at first, and the deeper you go, the more surreal things get. The journey through this game plays out like a fever dream that you just can't wake up from. It's unsettling without always being startling, and it's methodically paced instead of being, a relentless onslaught of danger and violence. If you're looking for that sticky sense of, dread that drenches over you that you used to get from old classic Silent Hill games, it's worth getting lost in Vivo. Teacher Dan can assign further game homework. Yes, that is true. Okay. So, how about some more spooky, but maybe a little less actual spooky and some more exciting spooky? Who here remembers from a classic franchise, Symphony of the Night? Man, these sections are getting easier and easier. I feel like this is the second or third game in a row I could just roll the footage and not have to explain anything. One of the oldest and most venerated video game franchises, Castlevania has had its hits and misses, but many often consider the PlayStation entry Symphony of the Night to be the series' high watermark, as it was the first game to establish not only a core identity within its own franchise, but also go on to become one of the two games endlessly recited as part of an entire new gaming genre. Because this is, after all, the game that put the Vania into what we now call Metroidvanias. But what made Symphony of the Night stand out upon its release was everything that was trendy in game design at the time that it didn't do. 3D graphics were becoming a standard in big-budget releases by the late 90s, and franchises like Super Mario and Final Fantasy had already moved in that direction with admirable success. Despite all that, here was Castlevania that was still married to 2D pixel art and side-scrolling platforming level design. But it was very refined, and in the additional horsepower of systems like the new Sony PlayStation at the time meant that there was a lot of breathing room for the game that didn't feel the need to stretch itself too far out to chase current design trends. The game could focus on being packed with larger, interconnected levels, hundreds of different enemies and spell effects, CD quality audio and music, all of that without, needing an additional 2 or 3 discs worth of storage space like the current entries in similar long-running franchises like Final Fantasy or Metal Gear. So the focus instead was turning the entire adventure through Dracula's castle into a sprawling maze full of secrets, shortcuts, and hidden treasures to be found. And by the time the adventure had come to a close, players had felt that they had the whole gigantic castle memorized because it was so uniquely designed, but designed very memorable in a very memorable way. And they were, also decked out by the end of the game with enough power and magic to move through it all effortlessly and conquer all of its challenges, and then go on to speedrun the game into oblivion. But suffice to say, there's an indie for that too. Time Spinner has the advantage of being developed during the mighty pixel art retro boom of the mid-2010s, but it definitely followed the same steps that Symphony of the Night laid out in terms of doing more with less. Once again, we are in highly detailed and well-animated pixel art territory rather than 3D graphics. Tried and tested jump-and-shoot 2D platform gameplay, and sprinkles of RPG elements like, leveling up your character and advancing the game's plot with dialogue with NPCs. Some of the smaller details that you see here in the gameplay footage will appear to be, at first, just like wholesale ripped off from the PlayStation Classic we were just talking about. Things like the interface, or all the flurry of numbers that pop up whenever the player or characters take damage. This game even has a slew of small little familiars that'll follow you around, just like Alucard's familiars in Symphony of the Night. But Time Spinner does distinguish itself in a little bit in a few other areas, though. There's a better variety of primary weapons for the player character instead of just spending the whole adventure just swinging a blade over and over. And the game's also got a Prince of Persia-style time-stopping ability, hence the title, which can be used not only in combat but also for traversal puzzles as well. So the spirit of refining classic gameplay mechanics has endured and improved on itself more and more as the video gaming medium just gets decades older, and I think this is a shining prime example of that. Now, not every game that takes what's come before and polishes it up with fresh ideas gets to go down in history as being a genre-defining entry like Symphony of the Night did, but games like Time Spinner and every other pixel graphic Metroidvania game that you see on all the indie fests now, when they come out, they show that there's always room for expansion and improvement, even within venerated gaming subgenres. Okay, I got one more, but I wanted to take a breath here. First of all, because I wanted to check on my time. Oh, we got lots of time here, so there might be an opportunity after we get through this last one here to maybe do a little Q&A if you guys want to mention something or whatever, but I wanted to take a step here before this last entry because I kind of changed up my format a little bit for this last one here. See, on my way to getting to a nice round 10 entries for this list, I noticed a particular era and specific category of gaming that a lot of what I've included in the Do You Remember sections of this list have landed in. And when I was sorting through all of the indies that I've played recently, one jumped out at me that I really, really wanted to feature here, but I couldn't think of a more specific old school analog to relate it to. So I decided to broaden things up a little bit for this last entry here. So with that said, who here remembers the entire early 3D gaming era? Yeah, like pretty much everything in the 5-year window from Mario 64 all the way up to, I'd say, Final Fantasy 9 or so. In particular on consoles like the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Now, most Gen X and older millennial gamers like myself consider their golden age of video games to land sometime in the Pleistocene age, around when Nintendo broke out in North America in probably like the 80s. But a generation or two later, there was another explosion of creativity in gaming technology that began to give developers the tools they needed to build even more creative gaming worlds. Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, is often cited as a classic, foundational entry in a series that already had 4 games before it, because, at long last, the land of Hyrule felt as huge and epic as the stories that came out of it always implied it was. Games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill proved that video games could at last be genuinely terrifying. Final Fantasy VII told a whole generation of gamers a 30-hour epic story that we're all taking decades to retell ourselves and our kids in remakes and remasters to this day. And those are just some of the bigger titles of the era. There were hundreds of titles, little tiny indie games that came out in the early 3D gaming era that are hidden in the shadows of these towering franchises and releases. And all of them had these unique, brightly built worlds, or some of them were dark fantasies, some of them had mysterious wonders or cool new mechanics, some of them had hard-hitting battles, and it was just a nice variety of games that were coming out. It's often stated that the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 have one of the most diverse and robust gaming libraries of any gaming generation. New genres were being created in this era. Older genres were given facelifts. There was a lot to see, and with the tools like the internet, for example, also burgeoning at that time, there were a lot more people willing to seek out something in these new 3D gaming worlds that they might like. Well, there's so many indies for that, but I've got one, a little teeny tiny one here that I really wanted to feature that maybe not a lot of you have heard about. This is called Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams. This is a solo-developed love letter to the exact era of gaming that I was talking about. I don't know that I've ever played a game that encapsulates the look and feel of an entire generation of games that isn't Shovel Knight more than Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams. If you owned a PlayStation, an N64, even a late 90s PC, and you can remember playing something on those systems, there's probably something waiting for you in the worlds of this game that will hit you right in your gaming nostalgia. But what is this game? Okay, well, so the setting of this game is you are a faceless, nameless dreamer exploring dreams and nightmares, hence the title, searching for missing fragments of a crystal that has become fragmented and scattered across all of dreaming itself. It's a little bit of a Kirby gamut, you know, but a little less adorable, but a lot more specific in its aesthetic aspirations. But it serves as a cute framing device excuse and as an excuse to dive in and out of a dozen different worlds that could all have been their own individual games by themselves, each one sitting as a rentable title on the game shelves at Blockbuster Video in around 1999. Yes, I'm old. You know, this game has a Zelda-esque dungeon filled with puzzles to solve and treasure to collect. There's a desert wasteland to cross aboard giant birds that are not unlike chocobos. There's winter wastelands to traverse. There's a spaceship to float through. You name it. You know, one world in this game might be an oversaturated candy land with a prince that has this cozy little fetch quest for you to fulfill. And then the very next world might be an abandoned haunted mall right out of Silent Hill. You know, there's an abstract water garden right out of a game like Myst. There's a village of mushroom people in this game. That's pretty much straight out of a Mario game. Hell, this game even has a water temple. You know, if you missed out on exploring any of the colorful worlds that were born out of a very specific age in gaming history, you can get a little taste of all of that dreamy experiences available in Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams. No, not a water temple. Yes. Take the good with the bad. And there you have it. A new crop of indie games, not unlike quite a few franchises and series we all remember from gaming years gone by. All the tropes. There's always a water temple, yes. Yep, we're not old. We just have more levels in life than most. That's a great way to think about it, but yeah. Goodness me. So yeah, blasted through that list pretty good. Hopefully everybody, like I said, has new games. What'd you guys think? Are there any games that maybe popped up in your minds as we went through that list that maybe some you'd like to share or whatever? Because we've got a little bit of time here. If you've got any questions or whatever that we can dive into as we eat up a little bit of time here before we close things down. I kind of blasted through that a little quickly there, and I didn't really have a lot of time to stop in between some of those games there to take quotes or whatever, but I appreciate everybody popping off and having a good time going on about all of those games and whatnot. Woodle Tree. Crossing fingers for Woodle Tree. Z, I'm guessing that a lot of the Do You Remember sections in there maybe hit you in your gaming nostalgias, because you're all about the nostalgias, as most of us are. But as I said, I'm going to be probably over in the gaming discussion channel on Kanji's Discord throughout the entire weekend. So if you can think of any games that maybe jumped up in your mind that would have fit well onto my list here of like new indie games that remind you of old indie games, or maybe you wish there was an old indie game or an old gaming franchise that would get a new indie game inspired thing to it, you know, post links, videos, and everything like that over in that video game channel on Kanji's Discord, because I'd love to see them. Yeah. Any notable games that you left off the list that you'd like to have mentioned, Dan? So many. Like there's a Next Fest going on Steam right now that is just a barrage of demos and whatnot. And there were like probably 3 or 4 titles from that I was thinking of cramming into this list last minute, but I had already, written up my script and rehearsed it already, and I did not want to go over time. But I could probably think of quite a few that I will stuff in there, and I'll probably mention them over on that channel for sure. Yep. If you've got indie games that you've made yourself, for sure, yeah. GoldenEye for the N64. I got kicked out of grade 9 geography class because my friend couldn't stop talking about potential multiplayer scenarios. Yeah, you know what you should look for, Clay, who's definitely subbing in for Jen there. You should look for an indie game that's actually coming out called Agent 64, because it is a exact homage to GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, the two, N64 shooters. Look that game up. I played a demo of it on a stream a while back, and everybody was just like, it borrows some of the sound effects straight out of games like GoldenEye. Yeah. We had the developers of Quench in here last year. That's a neat game. Yes, also a very cool game. I've actually played that as well. I think I was backing that game back when it was a Kickstarter project. Mini Metro is another good indie type game if you happen to be into like city planning type games. Things like SimCity or even Civilization, but more like SimCity, that kind of thing. Mini Metro is a good inspired choice from a game like that. There's even a city building game coming from the makers of all those SteamWorld games coming out. It's called SteamWorld Build, where you build like a little robot western town, but it's like a SimCity type game. And that's from the developers of games like SteamWorld Dig, SteamWorld Heist. So you should have a look out for that. The demo for that, I think, is available as well. All I can say is the symphonic version of Pong starting up the Video Game Live Retro Gaming Suite is so good. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I would love a more simple version of SimCity for my phone. Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know, like, SimCity seems to me like it would be a hard thing to translate to touchscreen, unfortunately, because SimCity involves a lot of meticulous little, like, menu manipulation and whatnot, and it's kind of hard to translate something like that to a touchscreen. It's not impossible, though. I'm pretty sure I've seen a lot of city builders on mobile devices. The problem with those is they very often fall into those traps of becoming like those freemium games. And, you know, because city building games are often based on resource management, a very easy way to turn it into a cheesy freemium game is to limit your resources and then, you know, make you want to pay for them. So I played a parking game in Game Slice last year that was also a lot of fun. Was that truck driving game, or was that other game that you were playing? All I can say is, yeah, so much fun. Indeed. That's it for me, though, I think. Probably will wrap up here. I know I've got a good 10 minutes or so, but maybe I'll give Lindsay the wheel back again so that she can take you guys through what's coming up next throughout Conji, throughout the rest of the day, and run some ads and all that fun stuff and whatnot. And we'll have a good time. Make sure to stay tuned, because coming up in the next hour block, I believe we've also got more gaming, but of a different type, with some tabletop gaming stuff coming up in the next hour. I believe Big Mike from D20 Live is going to be taking the reins at 2 o'clock there to talk about some tabletop gaming. So you'll want to stick around from that, because it's going to be a gaming afternoon. In the meantime, though, big thanks to Conji for giving me the opportunity to come on here and just gush about all of these indie games that I really enjoyed talking about. It was a lot of fun, and I'm hoping to get to do this again whenever the opportunity arises. But like I said, I'm going to bow out everything. I will catch you guys back here probably for the Masquerade, because I'm definitely sticking around for that. And like I said, I'll be over in that video games channel on Conji's Discord if you want to talk shop about indie games, old school games, anything, post links, whatever. Definitely hit me up on over there, share some links or whatever, and we'll have a good time doing that. But everybody, enjoy the rest of Conji. And my name's Dan the Video Ninja, and I will catch you guys all later. Take care.